Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be going through kidney failures and treatments for your A-level biology. Now, to go with this, over on the website there are loads of questions you can use as a follow-up.
Medical diagnostics, testing urine. Urine can be tested for many different substances, and this is used as a diagnostic tool because the presence of certain chemicals or proteins in the urine can give an indication of how not only the kidneys are functioning, but how other parts of the body might be changing or functioning as well. So we're going to look at a few different ways that we can test urine, but one of the easiest ways is just these simple test strips that you can dip in and they change colour and they can be used to show if certain substances are present or not in the urine. They can, through a gradient of colour, sometimes also show or give an indication of how much or the concentration of that substance. One thing we can use these test strips for is to check for the presence of glucose in the urine. This would indicate diabetes because the proximal convoluted tubule cells are not able to reabsorb it all if there's too much in the blood. And we know that diabetes can increase glucose levels in the blood. Another thing we can use these test strips for is protein. Albumin, for example, is a common plasma protein. So if this is found in the urine, that it could indicate kidney failure or high blood pressure. Either way, the filtration system is not functioning properly because obviously plasma proteins should not be making it through the glomerulus, out of the blood plasma and into the filtrate. So if that is happening, it could be because of high blood pressure is forcing these plasma proteins out through the capillary walls because they've got damage or the holes in the capillaries are larger than normal, or something to do with kidney failure. So the glomerulus itself, the basement membrane, that filtration part is being damaged. Could be due to an infection or something else, and that's how protein is coming out into the urine. There are two other ways than those simple test strips that are a bit more complicated and a bit more accurate that we can use to test for other substances being present in urine. Using antibody test strips is one way, and this can be used to detect pregnancy or to detect the presence of drugs. It works by having two strips. In this case, we've got two strips because it allows us to check that the test strip actually worked. Sometimes there is only one strip. One contains immobilized antibodies that are complementary to the antibody attached to a blue bead, which will be present at the bottom of the test strip and is how we get that blue line that you can see. The other test strip is a same immobilized antibody strip, but this time the antibody is complementary, in this case for a pregnancy test, to the human chorionic gonadotrophin hormone, which will be present in the urine if someone is pregnant. So down the bottom we have our blue beads, and they have antibodies that also are complementary to HCG. This means that when the sample is added to the bottom of the test strip, the urine sample, if the urine sample contains HCG, it will bind to the antibodies that are attached to the blue beads. The idea then is that the fluid moves up the test strip towards the two immobilized strips at the top. And when the blue beads with the antibodies reach the first test strip, if HCG is present, it will bind to those antibodies. And so the blue beads will stop at that first line. Some of them may move past as well and go to the second line, and they will then bind to the second test strip because the test strip at the top is just complementary to the blue beads. That means that if someone is pregnant and HCG is present in the urine, we will get two positive blue lines. One to show that HCG is present and one to show that the test worked because the fluid moved all the way to the top strip. If there is no HCG present, then the blue beads will move up, not bind to the first test strip, but they will bind to the second test strip because that is just complementary to the blue beads. And therefore we know that the test worked, so it wasn't a fail, but we know that there's no HCG present, so only one line means no pregnancy. This can be used for pregnancy and to test for the hormone presence, this protein hormone, but it could also be used to test for the presence of other recreational drugs with antibodies that are complementary to the shape of different drug shapes or proteins. The second method for testing the presence of substances in urine is using gas chromatography mass spectrometry. This can be used to look, for example, steroids or recreational drugs. This could be to confirm an earlier test strip result with gas chromatography mass spectrometry. The first stage is that the urine sample is turned into a gas or vaporized. This then passes through a column which contains a special polymer that allows the substances to separate out as they move through the column at different speeds. The substances are then converted to ions. This happens in the mass spectrometer, and then these ions are analysed by a computer. The results can then be compared to known substances in order to identify them. Kidney failure and treatments. Kidneys can fail when their normal function is affected. It can be detected by measuring the glomerular filtration rate, which is how fast the filtrate is moving through the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. In kidneys that are failing, the glomerular filtration rate will be reduced compared to normal function. It can be caused by infection, because when you have an infection, we have swelling, and the swelling will cause damage to cells, which stops them from working properly. It can also be caused by high blood pressure, which can cause damage to the capillaries in the glomerulus. If the capillaries in the glomerulus are damaged, large molecules such as proteins can actually get through and into the Bowman's capsule when normally they would be too large to fit through. So this means that proteins will be present in the urine, and this is one way of detecting damage to the glomerulus. We have to think about what problems and symptoms someone with kidney failure might suffer from. Waste products, including urea, are going to build up in the body, which can create toxic environments. There can be swelling around the ankles, the lower body, abdomen, due to tissue fluid building up, because there is excess water in the blood. That means the water potential of the blood is changed, and that means that less tissue fluid will be reabsorbed. There will be an imbalance in electrolytes. And by electrolytes, we mean dissolved ions in the blood and the tissue fluid. This can cause acidic pH of the blood, which we know can damage cells. It can also lead to more water retention, which again increases the chance of swelling. Long-term kidney failure can result in anemia, which is a lack of hemoglobin. So when the kidneys fail, there's a couple of options for treatment. One is dialysis, and first of all, we're going to look at hemodialysis, and the other is a transplant. Patients can be attached to a machine, so the blood leaves their body and goes into this machine where it filters it and removes the waste products, so the excess ions and also urea, and then it passes back into the body having been cleaned. There is a dialysis membrane which separates the blood and the dialysis fluid. This is a partially permeable membrane, so it only allows those small molecules through, but the large molecules stay in the blood, just like in the kidney. The dialysis fluid in the machine contains a normal blood glucose concentration, a normal iron concentration, and no urea. So it's basically trying to make it the same or isotonic to the blood plasma. The dialysis fluid flows in the opposite direction to the blood to make sure it maintains the concentration gradient, which maximizes the diffusion between the two fluids. As the blood goes into the machine, it's mixed with an anticoagulant. This is a substance that helps to prevent the blood from clotting in the machine, so it thins the blood to help it travel through the tubes. So as blood flows past the dialysis fluid, diffusion occurs. Urea diffuses from the blood to the fluid across the membrane. Any excess ions will diffuse from the blood into the dialysis fluid, or if ions are in low concentration in the blood, so they need to top up some of those ions, they will diffuse from higher concentration in the dialysis fluid into the blood instead. There's no movement of glucose because this is needed in the body for respiration, so the glucose concentration in both the dialysis fluid and the blood should be the same, and this prevents diffusion from happening. So what are the advantages of dialysis? It allows someone with kidney failure to maintain health whilst waiting for a transplant. Blood is returned to the body cleaned with less urea. This prevents toxic substances building up from the kidney failure. It's available to all patients, so there's no need to wait for a donor like there is with transplants, and there's no need to take immunosuppressant drugs or anti-rejection medication, which is also needed if you have a transplant. What are some of the disadvantages of dialysis? It works for a limited time only, so you can't be on dialysis forever, and eventually it will stop working. Whilst on dialysis, you need to try and keep a low protein diet to reduce the amount of amino acids in the body, so you produce the amount of urea being produced. Patients can begin to feel unwell between dialysis sessions as waste is building up in the body. It can be quite an inconvenient process for the patient as it takes up a lot of time. Each session takes over 3 hours and they have to do this 3 times a week. So it could affect their work and their life. It's also expensive for an NHS or a hospital to run and provide this service for kidney patients. Another treatment is a kidney transplant. Kidneys for kidney transplants can come from dead or living donors. Living donors are often relatives. This is because a kidney must be the same blood type and tissue type as the patient in order for the transplant to be successful. This is because it's got to try and reduce the difference in the antigens. So when you receive tissue or an organ from another person who is genetically different to you, then the antigens on those cells are going to be different to the antigens on your cells. And your immune system will react to these antigens in the same way it reacts to the antigens on pathogens. A good tissue type match or someone who's closely related to you will have more similar antigens to you, so it reduces that chance of rejection and reduces the chance of an immune response. People are able to donate kidneys because you can live with only one kidney. And that means that everyone is able to donate one of their kidneys as long as they have 2 and they're fully functioning. The advantages of kidney transplants. They are cheaper than dialysis. This is because dialysis is a long-term treatment, so the costs build up over time. It's less inconvenient for patients. It does not take up as much time, and then once the transplant has happened, then the person no longer needs to go on dialysis, and they should feel well as soon as they have recovered from the surgery. Long term, the patients can go on to live quite a healthy life and go back to normal. They may find issues with the kidney, but not after years and years and years. So they can have years of a healthy life, which they can't necessarily have on dialysis. The disadvantages compared to dialysis, it involves major surgery, which comes with big risks from the anesthetic and from infection. So it's one of the big disadvantages of having a transplant. Despite having a blood and tissue type match, patients will still have to take immune suppressant drugs for the rest of their lives. This is not only something you have to remember to do and pay for, but also it means that they are more at risk of certain infections. Even with all of this as well, there is still the chance that the organ could be rejected. There is also a shortage of organ donors. So there aren't many people necessarily able to donate the kidneys, or there aren't many tissue matches. So some people could die whilst waiting for a transplant.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I'll explain scratches.